We would like to go ahead and start with our first talk, a first dialogue. In this one, I'm going to be inviting on stage Dr. V. Anantha Nageswaran, who's the Chief Economic Advisor to Government of India, and Ms. Kavita Gupta, who's the founder and GP Delta Blockchain Fund, to join us onto the stage for this discussion, the first one to kickstart for today. Welcome, gentlemen. Welcome, ma'am. Please join us on the stage.
So this session is a dialogue moderated by Ms. Kavita Gupta, where our esteemed guest speakers will be discussing global threats caused by inequality, climate, and economic instability. During this dialogue, the panel will touch upon some of the most pressing issues in the current social and economic scenario. So the stage is all yours, Kavita.
So, Dr. Anantha, welcome to the FinTech Festival. How are you doing today, sir?
Thank you. I'm doing well. Thank you. It seems like a very impressive affair.
So this is the first session, and today what we are talking about is how climate risk is actually creating inequality and also opportunities with respect to technology and the access to education, health, and various other factors. So even before I go to some numbers which we figured out, like for an example, per capita GDP has been lowered by 17 to 31% at the poorest 4 deciles of the population-weighted country level per capita GDP distribution, which has actually resulted in a 25% bigger ratio between the top and bottom decile than in a world without global warming. So when you hear about something which mankind has some control but doesn't have a full control, as an individual, yes, I can switch off lights at my house, can use AC a little less, can use car a little less, but as a whole humanity, I have very little control. But it does affect where do I live. How do you look at that problem from the economic perspective?
So the numbers that you read out, they were globally, they were global numbers. Yeah. So I think the problem of inequality predates climate change discussion. The inequality issue has been kind of germinating over the last 20 years, not because of climate change, but also partly because of the way the global economy has evolved with a winner-take-all approach. And much of it is due to the kind of monetary policies followed in the developed world since 97, 98, Asian crisis, the collapse of long-term capital management, 2009-11 and 2001, tech bubble collapse at that time. So every time there was an economic slowdown, central banks used low interest rates and liquidity as the only answer, which in turn led to quick recovery in asset prices, in stock markets, real estate. Naturally, only those who have collateral will be able to use it. So when asset prices go up, those who have assets can use them as collateral and raise even further money to further invest, etc. So basically what has happened in the last 20 odd years is that the global economy has been driven more by asset markets, rather than by real economic activity. That's the big driver of inequality, in my opinion. Now, coming to the climate change issue, you are right. There are a lot of things that we can do at our micro level. You talked about switching off your AC, switching off your power slightly early, or cycling to work rather than driving, and using, let's say, video conferencing rather than traveling on air to go and discuss climate change. Okay, so we can do all of that. And these are important. We shouldn't trivialize them, because collectively, if 8 billion people, and let's say 3 or 2 billion of them have access to these kinds of facilities and options, and if they do exercise their option in favor of more climate-friendly choices, it will make an impact. And the reason that I think you touched upon this aspect very well, because recently, the OECD did a survey of the entire G20 countries. About 2,000 people were surveyed across income divide, across education divide, gender representation, age, everything was well represented. 2,000 people in every country, about 40,000 people were interviewed, and they were asked to give responses about their attitude towards climate change, carbon emissions, and what kind of policies would induce them to change their behavior. And they were also asked, will you change your driving habits? Will you change your meat eating habits? Because to generate 1 ton of or 1 kilogram of meat, the amount of food grains you have to produce, and that in turn requires so much of water, right? So it is not simply about cutting back on meat eating for any other reason. Even if you are a climate activist, there is a logical
industrialization.
Exactly. So interestingly, what came out of that response was, in developing countries, particularly India and China, the public were much more willing to consider behavioral changes in these 3 dimensions: driving, flying, meat eating. Whereas in developed countries, the public were very resistant to the idea of making behavioral changes. So while we talk of the big picture, government initiatives and so on and so forth, the private sector, which includes households and ordinary people, their behavioral change is going to make a big difference to whether climate change mitigation successfully happens or not.
So you also, it's a very good point, like how individual behavior from different economic disparity markets have the impact. And I think that was the basis for COP21 and COP26, where India and China kept on saying that the so-called industrialized developed countries have already created this, but they want countries like China and India, who are going there with the economic parity, wants them to take the burden of it on cutting it down. But at the same time, India did announce, starting from 2030, then 35, then 40, that it is going to have electric cars, everything is going to be electric cars, there's going to be majority renewable energy, but we are still one of the biggest coal-used country. Now the question which I have, instead of going directly on pollution, is the economic impact of that. You talked about assets and collateralization. The whole idea of green bonds was to start creating that asset class for your renewable energy infrastructure operational expenses to be taken care of. How successful do you think as a country from that macroeconomic, also given the pandemic, we are sticking to that timeline? Or where do you practically see us going?
No, I think, Kavita, you have touched upon multiple dimensions, starting from the COP26 summit and what we call the common but differentiated responsibilities. Yeah. The problem is common, but bulk of it is a legacy creation, emission. And in 2009, I think it was in Seoul, if I'm not mistaken, developed countries committed to provide $100 billion per year, but hardly a fraction of that has come out. It was supposed to be $100 billion every year. Okay. And now the requirements have gone up manifold. Even without even looking at the higher requirement, even that $100 billion hasn't come through on an annual basis. At the very minimum, it should be indexed to inflation. Okay? Yeah. So when you mentioned, you also touched upon coal emission by India. Now, if you look at this year, many European countries, Austria, Denmark, Germany, have either restarted their coal generating power plants, coal using power plants, or they have postponed their shutting down. And they have said that they will start relying less on Russian oil and gas from the end of this year and phase it out over the next 2 years. So what I'm saying is, when push comes to a shove, energy security becomes more important for every nation, rather than the so-called green transition. So that cannot be different for developing countries.
one of the political impact which we are seeing in Europe right now with the Russian-Ukrainian war, especially with Germany.
Exactly. And just last 1 week or 2 weeks, you have seen so many countries postponing their plans to cut back on fossil fuel usage, reopening coal-fired power plants, etc. And German minister has said there is no question of phasing out internal combustion engine-based cars by 2035. It is not going to happen. That's what he has said. So every country does trade off its near and medium term priorities versus this long term priority. And the problem is that the long term will always remain long term until one day it suddenly becomes short term and immediate.
Yeah.
So there is therefore a natural incentive problem for human beings in prioritizing the long term over the short term imperatives. And this current ongoing conflict in Europe has only compounded this trade-off. So India, as far as India is concerned, we realize that until now, in fact, most of the initiatives we have taken are being self-funded.
Okay.
Okay.
What about during Obama administration, and I'm not sure whether that continued during Trump administration, but there was the 100 billion which you are talking about, especially after COP24. There was a huge amount of money coming from Obama administration for Indian government to support at the private level for people to do more renewable energy plants.
I'm not sure about a huge amount of money. I don't, at least I'm not privy to that information, okay?
Okay, so there was a lot of association under OPEC, which was talking about moving over $500 million every year.
No, the sums involved are running into trillions, and not only for Asia, I mean India, but also for African countries which have to rely on coal quite a bit to grow. So this $100 billion committed in Seoul, I think, has not come through at all. And if anything, the requirements are only expanded manifold. So it is not just also resources. What the Western nations talk about is how do we get the private sector to finance these things?
Yes.
But the problem with private sector is you have to get the devil into, there is a devil in the details. What is the quantum? What are the terms on which they come? And what is the cost of those funds? And will that be affordable? Now that interest rates are rising in every country, so what will be the cost of those funds coming from the private sector? So can the multilateral institutions like the World Bank, European Investment Bank or AIIB, etc., can they provide the first loss guarantee or backstops, etc., such a way that the private sector cost of funds is lowered? These are all the devil in the details, and then there is this new sustainability standards.
Yep.
So companies that look for green funding over time have to follow some of these as per their accounting standards, also have to do sustainability standards reporting. Now, there is not only a question of the onerous nature of some of the requirements, but also the skill set that is required to be able to comply with these is not uniformly available across the world.
So exactly going to that point, like let's come to India. Within India, we have all acknowledged that access to energy is now a very big pattern of what is access to life you have, whether it's just a better life, education, health, technology. So Prime Minister Modi has always talked about going and electrifying every village in this country. Now, when we talk about electrifying that every village in the country, there have been a very good initiative of solar lamps and some renewable energy part, but the backbone still continues to be coal. So it's a choice between going with that climate change or providing that access to life and trying to create some parity. Do you see that as a choice, or do you see that as a connected part which can be worked together?
No, it's a transition. It won't happen overnight. In the short run, as I mentioned earlier, not just India, many countries still rely on coal globally, including in the developed nations. But at the same time, India has announced a national hydrogen mission, and we are the leaders of the International Solar Alliance, etc. So, and we have a fairly well laid out plan, and the share of power generated by non-fossil fuel based power plants, that actually is increasing. Okay? So we should not just look at the proportion of power that comes through coal-fired plants, but we should also look at the trend. The trend is moving in the right direction. That is more power is being generated by non-fossil fuel based power plants. So that is the trend that is happening, and that will continue. But we always have to keep one eye on our development priorities as well as preparing ourselves for the long-term climate change and the mitigation efforts as well. It is a balancing act, and there is no, what shall I say, ready template to manage this. We have to improvise as we go along while keeping the goals in mind.
Yeah. So what are the best technologies in the space do you see? Or has government felt like this particular technology has really changed and moved more towards those goals and those missions?
No, it will be presumptuous of me to pretend that I know enough about technology on climate-related matters to be able to answer that question. But who knows, I mean, whether it is battery energy storage, or whether it is hydrogen cells, or those kinds, fuel cells, those kinds of technologies are the ones that hold the greatest promise. Right now, what will be very important to us will be the storage aspect.
Yes.
If that is cracked, and that will be a major...
Without using extra energy for cooling it down.
Exactly.
Yes.
So that will be a major boost for decarbonization efforts. Yeah.
And so, at a lot of places now, micro-nuclear reactors as a nuclear energy for a big level, like Elon Musk has spoken about it. Now Japan, after the huge disaster, is now again thinking not at the mass level. What do you think is India's position?
I think India is very much actively exploring that. I think, but where we are with respect to the actualization of these and whether we are on the drawing board stage, that I'm not fully aware of. But India is looking at it very seriously. And if you also look at Europe, after Germany swore off nuclear power plants, they are also now re-examining it. The UK is very much interested in that. So I think the discussion is getting started on having nuclear energy as an important viable option. Even in fact, one step further, even natural gas is coming into play as an important transition energy mix. Before we move completely away. So that is the important thing. So I think the transition has to happen from coal, hydrocarbon to natural gas to nuclear, and then to completely renewable energy sources. That's the kind of transition path that we have to envisage. And I think the answer will have to be involve all these elements, not just one or the other. We can't be exclusive here.
Yeah, but so the time proportionate which we are talking about, like this year already, it is one of the most crazy summer in Europe. And I'm just landed there yesterday, and it was 28 for 38 degrees in Paris and in London. It is like unbearable. Delhi heat, we both are just coming down from here. So if the weather will continue to be harsher and harsher, both winters and summers, and comparatively to that, the proportion in which we are responding as a humankind, do you think we are really mapping the curve?
No, I think again, I wish the answer was a very strong affirmative answer to your question, which we don't know. But the important thing is, while there is that much we can do to mitigate, to stop or reverse the immediate trends in global warming, which may not be able to do in the short run, what we can do is to mitigate the impact. And that comes from preparing our population in a disaster resilient manner. That is why the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, CDRI, is set up in Delhi. And just recently, some of the climate scientists who visited Delhi for a conference about 2 weeks ago, they went and visited CDRI and took a look at the work that they are doing. And they were very impressed with the modeling work that we are doing. And then, as you know very well, our National Disaster Management Agency also now has a 15 to 17 years of experience. Yeah. So, and that is why we are able to, and with also the weather predictions models improving, what we can do is to mitigate and minimize the human cost, while addressing the warming part of it is a more long-term effort. And that is what we are doing at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. So my last question to you, is there a model system which you have seen anywhere around the world which has got the balance between technology for the renewable energy or non-fossil fuel, as you said, while having the climate change effect? Like, is there a model anywhere around the world which has been used?
No, I'm not entirely sure I even understand the question, to be frank with you.
So what I've seen in the space is countries decide to go one extreme to another extreme. Like we just talked about Germany deciding absolutely not going, using coal and being dependent then politically on their energy needs, to then we see China, which says that they're going to try to keep on balancing between coal and renewable, but slowly, even their renewable plants construction is based on the energy from the coal. So has any economic model, which has come across any country which you thought is a right balance for the next 10 years
No,
to
I
be
think
used?
we are, no, I don't think, to the best of my knowledge, and I'm not saying I know much about this space in the sense of the technological solutions, but I don't think we have hit upon the right balance. I think if anything, if you ask the climate scientists, they would say there is no time for balance. You have to move 100% towards non-fossil fuel energy right away. But again, I think this current ongoing conflict in Europe also has set back some of the efforts. And the focus has shifted from energy transition back towards energy security, even in Europe. So in that sense, whatever balance that existed has actually become more unbalanced in the last 6 months or so.
Which is not a
That's
good
the reality, yeah.
Yeah. So, sir, just let me follow up one more on that. You also talked about as the interest rates are increasing, which basically makes it more difficult, a financial viability of going for the risky products like a huge level, let's say, solar plant. And World Bank, I.C.E, OPEC, like all those international organizations are also dependent upon G5 to G20 countries to give them the underwriting money to be able to take the first loss, which we are seeing a lot of not happening, the amount of money which World Bank has been asking in last couple of years. So if we go with that notion that that will continue for another 2-3 years, do you think that's a big setback for the climate renewable energy industry as a technology?
No, status quo, I wouldn't call it a setback. I would say it is probably an opportunity lost. If the multilateral financial institutions can tweak their operating models, instead of direct lending, they become risk managers for to crowd in private capital. That would actually see the amount of funding available grow exponentially, okay? But it will take time. And we can start with smaller initiatives like information sharing between the multilateral institutions, first, and allowing domestic institutional money to come into the infrastructure sectors in developing countries, and creation of uniform standards. At the same time, allowing for the fact that developing countries are not in the same boat as developed countries. Because many of these things, the way they're evolving, my concern is that they become exclusionary in nature. We have to allow for the fact that developing countries need time, and many of these standards, which is what will satisfy the investors, cannot be applied indiscriminately across developed and developing nations. The so-called sustainability standards, ESG standards, etc., they have to make allowance for variable pathways and timelines between nations. So that is my concern. So in the process of ensuring that only genuine green projects are funded, etc., the risk is that we exclude a lot of countries from receiving the kind of investments they need. And that would further compound the problem. So I think the important thing to remember, as with many things in life, the road to hell is always paved with good intentions. and there is always this scope for the law of unintended consequences to play out. So when we talk about crowding in private sector, developing standards, and all these things, we have to make sure that the country's pathway and the context are both taken into consideration. Then in that case, we can make up for the time lost.
So, sir, what's your prediction for India? which year or how many years do you think where we can find a balance between?
No, I think we have very well laid out plans all the way until 2030. And by then, I think the government has ambitious targets for the share of renewable energy in our power generation and so on. I think we do look on course to get there. What is important is to have more concrete plans from 2030 to 2070. That is still in the drawing board. That's the key for us.
So 2030 is still the key milestone.
Yeah.
Perfect, sir. Looking forward to have a much more balanced climate changes and the technology working together for 2030.
Thank you for the conversation.
So
enjoy talking to you.